Hello everyone and welcome to this event hosted by the Centre for Law and Social Change at City, University of London. My name is Grietje Baars. I'm a reader in Law and Social Change at the City Law School, and I will be chairing today's event, which is the first to be put on by our new centre. This centre seeks to be a hub for connection on the topic of law and social change and to create a space to generate precisely such debate between scholars, practitioners, policymakers and students alike. We will generate such debate in public events, through publications, in scholarly and practitioner journals, and in-depth research projects, legal interventions, mainstream media and our teaching. You can follow the work of this new centre via our page on the City website and on Twitter @LawSocialChange. It is a special honor and pleasure to have Dr. Ballakrishnen with us at this event today. And they've been a dear friend and co-conspirator of mine for many years, and especially I'm honored because Swetha's work so well embodies the motivations and ethos that undergird this center. Swethaa Ballakrishnen is Assistant Professor of Law and, by courtesy, Sociology, Asian American Studies and Criminology, Law and Society and Faculty Co-Director at the Center for Empirical Research in the Legal Profession at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. Dr. Ballakrishnen describes their research as broadly resting at the intersection between law, globalization, and stratification. Specifically, across a range of sites and different levels of analysis, it interrogates the ways in which law and legal institutions create, continue, and counter different kinds of socio-economic inequalities. Within their research projects, Swethaa asks, what frameworks can law offer us for understanding social change and vice versa? Today, Dr. Ballakrishnen will discuss their book, published in 2021 by the Princeton University Press, entitled Accidental Feminism, Gender Parity and Selective Mobility Among India's Professional Elite. They are also the author of Invisible Institutionalisms, which will come out with Heart Publishing this year also. You can learn more about Swetha's work on their website, which is swethaa.com. Our commentator today is my colleague Sabrina Germain, who is a senior lecturer here at the City Law School. She is the co-coordinator with me and Sandhya Drew of the Centre for Law and Social Change and a member of City University's Centre for Healthcare and Innovation Research. Dr. Germain's research interests are in the field of healthcare law and policy and bioethics. She focuses on questions of distributive justice, resource allocation and access to healthcare services, and the role of medical professionals in the healthcare law-making process. Her monograph, Justice and Profit in Healthcare Law, was published by Hart in 2019. Her current research projects include one on the study of inequalities in access to healthcare for ethnic minorities and migrant women during the COVID-19 pandemic, together with Dr. Adrian Young, also at City. Dr. Germain is admitted to the practice of law in the state of New York and, like both myself and Dr. Ballakrishnen, has worked as a lawyer in an international law firm. Dr. Ballakrishnen today will speak for about 30 minutes, then we will have 15 minutes from Dr. Germain, after which I will open it up for discussion. Swethaa, the floor is yours.
But I appreciate all of you. I am going to, as Grietje said, try and speak for as little time as possible because I think so much of this book really works in the possibility for exchange and interaction. The best advice I got really about this book was people think of the book as the end of a conversation, right? Like you've spent 10 years thinking about it, it's in your head, you birth it, and then you think, okay, I know all the things about a thing. And actually, the reverse is true. I feel like it's just the start of a new set of conversations that I can have with people around a body of work that I think I've been living in solitude with for as long as I have. So it's such a joy to be here. I actually pitched a very early version of one of the chapters in this book at an early seminar that Grietje offered on the critical corporation 6 years ago in London, and it sort of breaks my heart that I'm actually not back to do this at City. But I've learned so much from you, Grietje, over the years, and I'm so grateful, Sabrina, for your generous offer to read and to read it. You know, I think any extra chore one puts on a to-do list right now is a chore that needs to be thanked in multitudes, right? Because it's just no longer, our time is so stretched. And so the fact that you took this on and read it and wanted to talk about it is something that I'm really deeply grateful for. So thank you. I want to make this interactive as possible. What I'm going to do is literally just run you through the empirical puzzle that started me on it, give you a little sense of the data that I'm working with, and then try and tell you the main argument of the book. It's a pretty recursive argument. I try and make it over and over again across different parts, but the theory piece of it, which is really, can we think about social movements? Can we think about agency? Can we think about justice and things that produce equity as accidental? That theoretical frame to it is something that I really hope we can talk more about in discussion, because I know a lot of us here are sort of thinking about it from a range of different angles. So this happens to be a book about Indian legal professionals, but I really hope it has things to say and do about movements and connections beyond it. So for those of you that don't know me, and I see a bunch of new faces, but I also just want to shout out my mom, who is here. This is the first live talk of my book that she's been able to attend. So it just makes my heart so happy that we can do it at a time zone which is India friendly. And it sort of makes me want to kick myself for not doing this earlier. So those of you that don't know me, and for those of you that do know me, I'm an assistant professor, as Grietje said, at UCI Law. My framing and methods are sort of rooted in law and society. That's my main intellectual home. I'm interested in sort of law and inequality, law and social change, which is why the synergies here are sort of particularly exciting. But I'm really interested in this idea of intention and accident, right? Like how much of the stuff that we do is produced by intentional thought and how much is serendipity? And if it's the latter, what do we do with it and how do we progress with it? I'm also really broadly interested in categories like modern and global and feminist, right? Like what do these words even do? How do they create certain constructions, and how do we sort of unpack them a little bit better? 10 years ago, if you'd asked me if I was a feminist, it would have been a resounding yes. And now I don't know, as a brown queer person that like holds multitudes, I don't know if like that word actually holds the same weight, or if it holds the same weight for others, or if having a word do a capture all is actually helpful. So one of the things about words like this is it both expands you want it to expand enough that it includes all the people you want it to include, but then when it starts doing inclusion so expansively, it starts to not be productive for everybody it's including, right? So those of us that have Marxist sort of leanings in this audience, and I know many of us do, sort of, there is a production of inclusion that is necessarily, paradoxically, hard for those it includes. And how to think about that as a law and society scholar is something that I haven't answered yet. And I actually feel very comfortable not knowing the answer to it. I think the production of theories like this is to sit with uncertainty, is to not have an answer, is to not have an outcome. I do sort of employ a critical sort of post-colonial lens. I'm interested in sort of multiplicities, how to think about Souths, but also in this continuum, right? Like it's not just, is it a success, is it a failure, is it working, is it not working, but how do we sit with something that's working and not working? A lot of my work is on the professions, but really the work that it's always interested in the connections between how do we think of the global, how do we think of inequality and equity, and how, and the sort of site where I'm usually studying is organizations. It just so happens that I study law firms, I study legal organizations, and I study law schools. That's sort of the broad foci. The project that I'm speaking about today didn't start off as a gender project, right? Like sort of, I've always been sort of interested in this, but it didn't start off as a feminist project. In the meta sense, it sort of was an accident in itself that this is the project that I came upon, and this is the book that I wrote. I'd been really interested in how globalization was changing organizations post 1991, which is when India liberalized its markets, and how that innovation was changing different kinds of work in India. And it could have gone any number of different ways, but it just so happened that early in this project, there was a sort of very, very early, it was the pilot interview stage. One of the female partners at this law firm sort of was aghast that I was asking about gender as a form of diversity. So one of my early papers from 2013 talks about this finding where the pilot really was the pilot study, which was really, I was trying to unpack how globalization was working in these different cities in India. And the woman who responded to it was like, why is this a form of diversity? Like I, went and visited the US, and when I was in the US, I was like the only non-white woman from like, quote unquote, like a developing country. And I'd never felt the same pressures that people seem to feel in New York, right? She was on a secondment at a large law firm in New York, and she just felt like this was not how she felt back home. Now, the sociologist in me is incredibly cynical, and I mean, which is much less true of the human in me, but like, so the response to that is just, okay, so this is some high class, high caste response, right? Like people with privilege just don't feel gender in the same ways people without privilege do. And maybe and also women underreport how they feel, right? We both want to believe women, but we also want to not believe women when they say they don't feel discrimination, because God forbid there be a place that doesn't have discrimination. And it's true, like most of the time, we self legitimize what looks like discrimination and pretend like that's not happening. But what was interesting was when I started looking at the data, there was sort of an interesting puzzle, right? So the Indian case sort of had a staggered liberalization. So different kinds of organizations and different kinds of firms were global in some sense, in ways that others were not. So it was actually a clean analytical variation from a design perspective. There were some fields that were super liberalized, and there were some fields that were not liberalized. And so from the perspective of trying to see how globalization was unpacking everyday work, it was an interesting field perspective. But the real puzzle happened because around the same time, a friend of mine who studies sort of like the demography of the legal profession showed that there was a increase in general, and these are trends that we sort of know over time, like there are just an increasing trend of women across all of the legal profession. Now, this is just numbers, yeah, this is just feminization. So there's an increase in the number of women across legal professions in the world, but the two exceptions were India and China, right? And so India had, I mean, this was using census data across countries. And what they showed was and this is Ethan Michelson at Indiana, and sort of what he showed was that India has sort of, according to his data, 5%, but then according to the other data, 10%, but it's still a really tiny number. Only 5%, 5 to 10% of the Indian legal profession is female, right? And so there are all these accounts of how gendered the legal profession was in this context. And in contrast, right, like in contrast, very elite law firms were sort of 50% female at entry, but also at higher levels of partnership, right? Like that's the empirical puzzle. So there's a lesser proportion of the entire profession that's female, but in the most elite law firms, women are 50% of like entry and sort of advanced partnership. And this happened because the year that I started pivoted and made this a sort of gender project, 70% of the partnership cohort the year before I started interviews sort of was female, right? In the two top law firms in the country. And it was one cohort, right? Like that's not the general number, but it was one cohort that was really striking. And this was happening at a time where US law firms and US sort of professional work was lamenting about how hard it is to, even though you've quote unquote fixed the pipeline, have women move through and do well, right? So the question then became, what is happening? What is the case for unusual gender parity that's happening here? It's also interesting because it feeds into a larger literature on where we think gender does well, right? So if you think about it, gender does well when there is a feminized workforce, right? Like so work in which women are good at doing, right? So there are more female nurses than not. And Sabrina, you know this literature well, but like medical professionals, self-select into where you think women's jobs or goods, right? So there's an essentialism argument to why there's a functional logic for why secretaries and that's actually what the literature will talk about, like secretaries and nurses, like that's how the census codes it, right? It's not personal assistants, it's a very gendered name type for what kind of work they do. And even if they manage to trickle into high status work, right? Like sort of occupations get desegregated, they get devalued in some way. So then there are women in medicine, but they're usually OBGYNs, right? There are women in law, but they're usually divorce attorneys. And it's sort of interesting to think about where it is women end up being. And it sort of is very obvious that they only are in places where essentialized work happens or work is low prestige, right? So it's very unique for there to be a case where high prestige work that is not gender typed to be particularly female ends up having women at the levels that it was. So the data and design sort of then started, I really was interested in these different levels of analysis. I was like, what's happening at the individual level, what's happening at the interactional level, and what's happening at the institutional level, right? This is a classic design model for feminist scholarship. Risman and sort of set this up in one of the earliest logics of like how to think through organizational gender. And so you can't just study it at one level of analysis, you have to think about it across levels of analysis. The data was sort of, I'm happy to talk more about this in Q&A, but essentially it was 139 ethnographic interviews over periods of time. I did double interviews for a lot of the respondents that varied different kinds of organizations, different kinds of spaces where they were in their trajectories. I did content analysis of everything that was written about law firms over that 12-year period that I was interested in. And I would do focus groups with these people, right? So there was a variation on the kinds of people I had in my sample, but the main focus was very successful women in these elite law firms. I oversampled women because I felt like that was useful, because it started becoming more and more useful as the themes started to arise, which is common in organizational sociology. The focus started being Mumbai, because I realized that if I varied the city, then the kinds of things that were causing the outcome was sort of too varied. Then there were too many moving parts, and I'm again happy to talk about design, but I ended up oversampling women with a focus in Mumbai. I sort of spoke mostly to senior women and men and sort of people who were coming through the pipeline. And I also had an attrition sample of people who didn't like quote unquote make it, right? Like to think about how all these different things work together to think about the data. Again, happy to talk about the data more, but I just want to highlight that it started off with law firms, and then I got a lot of pushback on like, oh, this might just be global work, right? Like this is just, it might be that very unique new work just happens to have better advantages. And so in the last phase of my research, I added a consulting firm and banking sort of sample. And the usefulness of that was to try and quote unquote test, right? Like whether this was just a globalization finding, right? Is it just that global work and modern work is better for women, which we know it's not true? Or is it that something very specific is happening in these particular kinds of law firms? And so that's sort of like the main, I'm also explaining 10 years worth of like data logics in 10 minutes. So I apologize if I'm going super quick, but I'm happy to talk about these methods more, because especially for those of you in the audience that are thinking through doing multi-method ethnographies over time, there's something so agoraphobic, right? There's so much, I talk about this in my research methods, about how so much of the research method was anxiety, right? Because every time I would add a new sample, I would think, oh my God, I'm varying so much. This is what's causing it and not this other thing, right? But it's also usefulness into thinking through what analytical variation was actually serving the finding and what was not. And I think it really served that I was collecting these data and analyzing it for over a decade, which when I was in grad school felt like impossible. But now that I'm at the other side of it, I'm so glad I sat with it as long as I did, because I think it was richer for it. So I'm just going to give you the main argument, and then Sabrina, you get the floor. But I will, and then I'm happy to keep coming back to any parts of this that might be helpful. So the main argument, right, is that there was unintentional parity, right? And it's a 4-part argument. I argue that all of the findings that we see, which is that women doing really well in these specific kinds of law firms, is a function of 4 different factors that sort of played on top of each other to produce what I call like this accidental outcome, right? So the feminism is not just the women, but it's also the firms. So the question is, are these firms accidentally feminist? Are they producing a certain kind of outcome that they didn't mean to produce? And the answer is sort of yes and no, as all good answers, right? Like, because it sort of starts with this idea that the first argument is that there wasn't a framework of reference. This is the frames chapter. There wasn't an idea of who a good corporate lawyer was, because it was so new. The market had sort of opened in 91. There was sort of a very new sense of what professional work was being called upon. And this idea of what Joan Williams calls the sort of Williams and Acker call the ideal worker, right? Like this is sort of this idea of like who's best suited to do this job didn't exist. Like, you know, in my legal professions class, I get my students sometimes to close their eyes and think about, you know, think about a law firm partner. Like, who do you see, right? And like 10 years ago, it was often like a corner office, you know, in sort of an older white man who was in, you know, some large law firm in New York. And sort of that's changed over the years, especially if you have someone personal that you think of as a lawyer. But for the most part, that is the ideal type. So inclusion that happens when there's already a set ideal type of who a good lawyer is harder to stick because it's working against this assumption that it's not already the ideal person. So even if you think you're doing diversity, you're doing inclusion without really believing that this is the new alternative. So I think one of the things that advantaged the Indian case was that there was no setup of who the pre-existing lawyer, a corporate lawyer was. It definitely existed in litigation. It existed in a lot of other work, but it didn't exist in the corporate law firm logic. This was sort of both because these firms were brand new, but also because the schools that produced the students that would then trickle into these firms was brand new. They both happened around 91. They didn't happen to feed into each other. The schools actually, as it happens, were set up as social justice schools. But they did start graduating students that were looking for very elite work and would trickle into these, that then ended up trickling into these firms to cement a very specific sort of professional identity that didn't exist from before. So that's the sort of first part of it. But then I argue that that couldn't have been the only thing because there are other new kinds of work, right? That post-1991 work that existed in India. If it was just an idea of newness, and this is where I use Cecilia Ridgway's argument of like newness helps us renegotiate hierarchy, and that's true. But if it was just newness, other kinds of new work should have had the same thing. And so part of what I argue is in the firms chapter, which is the second sort of big chapter, is that it wasn't just that it was new, it was also a new domestic firm facing a foreign market, right? So I call this speculative isomorphism, right? I argue that part of what was happening was that these were brand new firms, but they were also firms that were emerging from within the context of incredibly traditional old work. And they wanted to both differentiate themselves from these other older, traditional, backward thinking firms and sort of allude to mimicking global norms of meritocracy and sort of modernity. And part of how that mimicking ended up working was that they didn't fully have the scripts, right? And this is where the comparison with the business, the management consulting firms is really interesting because the management consulting firms were new. They were in Bombay. They sort of recruited sort of the same class of women and men, but they were global firms in an Indian logic, right? So they could very easily say, firm X is great worldwide. Look at our numbers, but this is India. Gender just works like this, right? Like, so they would actually say ideas of this is happening because India is backward. And they could say that because no one was going to question whether a fancy management consulting firm that has a global presence was not modern. They didn't need to do modernity by doing this in the Indian context, right? They already had their street cred and their organizational logics that didn't need to be vetted by their production of gender in the Indian context. Indian law firms that were foreign facing, however, and this is where the regulation is really important, right? Like, so Indian law firms were working from within the Indian context with foreign clients because of the ways in which the 91 regulations were set up. No foreign law firms were allowed in the country, but there's a lot of foreign work. And this regulatory change meant that they were exposed to foreign logics without actually having foreign connections. And this seems sort of this clearly wasn't set up. It's not like the 91 reforms or, the liberalization of markets happened because they wanted to have better feminist outcomes. They were not thinking about gender when this happened, right? Which is sort of feeds into this idea that it so happened that because it produced a unique case of local firms with global audiences that didn't have a background framework, they had a unique setup where women were not advantaged, but not specifically disadvantaged. And so I argue that what happened was because this was the only space where merit was going to produce gendered outcomes, it ended up advantaging a certain class of women who did not have that opportunity in any other space. So it's not that these firms were doing anything pro-women. It's literally that they weren't doing anything anti-women, and they didn't have a background framework of what it meant to have women in them. So this is why it's not fully feminism, and I have an entire chapter on whether this is even feminism, but it offered a space for gendered production in the workspace that didn't exist anyplace else, right? So this is the big distinction that sets up why it was not just the frames, but it was a specific set of firms within these framed contexts that produced them. The facings chapter talks about client interactions, and this is a chapter where I actually unpack how client interactions changed the ways in which essentialism was done, right? So because there was no pre-existing framework, clients would say, "Oh, we just want this person to work on our case because she gets the job done," right? So this is sort of the idea that women are detail-oriented and really committed to their job, right, usually works against their favor, right? But the fact that they were not aggressive, the fact that they were that they did what the client wanted them to, really helped within this particular setup because there was an abundance of work and there was no need to go and rainmake for your clients, right? It was an incredibly different structural setup where clients just wanted someone to quote unquote get the job done. And since this offered that space, women then had this reshaped valorization that didn't exist in other contexts. The sort of last piece of the puzzle is, of course, the families, right? You can't write a book about gender and not write about families, and which is sort of interesting. But sort of this is the place where I unpack what it meant to like have certain caste expectations and what does it mean to have like a certain familial expectation, who benefits, who doesn't, right? Like, and the fact is not so much that there's a work-life balance that's different in India. It's just that it's pre-existing logics of dependency, like who gets to take care of your child. Everyone has someone that takes care of their child. It's not an additional logic that gets added on only if you're a professional. But also the timing of it. These were women that finished their law degree in their early 20s. They were partners by the time they were 30s. They were not sacrificing having children to become partner, right? And so when they were making these negotiations, they were making these negotiations from a place of power rather than inferiority, right? They were not junior associates asking their partner if they could take extra time off. They were partners telling their clients that they would get the job done, but just give them some time, right? So there was a temporality logic to how family choices and life choices like sort of were not at odds with each other. And then I make an argument about how there's definitely something about the movement temporality, right? Like these women also had mothers and in-laws that were proximate, that could do childcare. That this is where caste played into, right? Like, so who did the official socializing of the child and who did the labor that was not that attractive could get divided between this very caste-dependent labor force and, extended family that was present. And so it sets up a range of overlapping factors that should have technically worked for all women, but particularly worked in the Indian case for these domestic law firms because of the ways in which a lot of organizational and institutional logics were set up. And that's why it's called, that's why the setup is accidental. It's why I'm torn about whether it should be feminism. And that's sort of why I grappled with the book for as long as I did, because the empirical pieces of this were pretty straightforward, but whether they produced the thing that I think they produced was something that I really had to theoretically grapple with before writing the book. So where do we go from here, right? So what do we do next? So the first part of it is really, how do we rethink novelty? How do we rethink timing? How do we reimagine who the ideal worker is? I think if COVID's done anything, it's reminded us that, space and time and whether you're physically present to be the person that does the most work is not necessary, right? This is always shaped what an ideal worker is. And I think there's new kinds of flexibility we can rethink for wondering how to reimagine what a good ideal worker is. The second part of it is also to rethink what intention is. One of the ways in which, when I present this book before it was a book, the response was always, and you can tell this is an American audience, because the response was always, but what about, how do we port this? How do we make this happen here, right? And there's no way in which you can make this happen anywhere else because the conditions that produced it were so, quote unquote, accidental. And accident is not a very useful theoretical, it's not a portable theoretical concept, right? Like if you tell someone this happened out of accident, that doesn't help anyone else because there's nothing you can do with it. But I don't think that's where the argument stops, right? Like I'm trying to argue that we need to be more critical about how we think about intention, because then it allows us a chance to look elsewhere for where it is we can be, where it is we can actually observe possibilities for better outcomes, right? So we're so set on thinking through what can produce good outcomes. And, my friend Mark Massoud does this in an entirely different context about how to think about the rule of law when it doesn't look like the rule of law, right? And I think part of what I'm arguing here is that a thing can be good or it can produce something that is valuable without wanting to produce it. And that means methodologically, we need to be looking elsewhere for what is producing possibility. And that could not actually look like what you want it to look. But I think as researchers, we owe it to ourselves to rethink where we're looking for good progress and good possibility. The last extension I want to end us with is sort of to think about the optics, right? So I think this optics piece is really important because I think there are so many perils. I think it's very powerful, right? So on the, okay, I'm directionally dyslexic, but on the left, I think, is Paul Weiss, right? Like, and sort of this idea of how to, they're actually a firm that is known to be pretty decent on diversity metrics, right? But one slip up like that, and that's what we're going to remember about that firm, right? Like this was a Twitter post from a few years ago. Actually, it happened just as I was starting to coalesce this book. So it was a really useful post, but it's useful to think about how the power of optics changes whether you think somebody is doing good in the world, right? And but there's also a flip side to it, which is that then it becomes all about narrative, right? India still doesn't have, it doesn't have like a maternity, the Maternity Benefit Amendment Act is still not fully passed, right? Like there are skips in how we think of hard law that could produce good outcomes for these women. But still, I think what's hopeful about this is that optics can produce sustainable outcomes by accident too, right? So there's a new mobility. It's a precarious mobility, but it's a new mobility. And I think the work now is to think about, now that we've had this accidental progress, how do we convert that to a very intentional cementing of that progress? And I want to end on a sort of fairly optimistic note, because I'd like to think there is optimism. There is cause for optimism here. And I think part of that is, no matter what you call it, part of it is that there's now an entire generation of mid-career women, right? Like that get to determine the course of these organizations. And I fall in the sort of what I call the David Wilkins camp of thinking about diversity, which is if you've hit good diversity when, people of color can be mediocre, right? And that's how I feel about it. So what's really overwhelmingly positive here is to think about how it offers the opportunity for women to not be a certain kind of women to do well in this firm, right? So it offers a range of possibility that I think is useful, but it also has a path dependency that is going to be produced by the fact that there are sheer numbers. So even if you don't think of it as politically feminist, there is a usefulness in the gendered representation that could have positive consequences over time. And now I'm convinced I've taken more than 20 minutes because I see Sabrina and Grietje polite nodding. So I'm going to stop here. But thank you all. And I'm really looking forward to questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Swethaa, and straight over to you, Sabrina.
Thank you so much. Swethaa, I only met you today. I've read your book for the past week, and I'm not surprised by what just happened. I had prepared notes. I had prepared a whole lot of things that I will still say because I've prepared them. But of course, you turn everything on its head because you've answered most of my questions. But I think there's so much more to unpack anyway. So I'll ask them again, as you can provide more detail on this. Grietje, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I think it's very exciting to see the center having this particular event to start with. This is something that, of course, resonated with me. I'll turn a little bit to my notes if you'll allow it, because there's so much to say. I think it's a delight to read Accidental Feminism for so many reasons, of course. The originality of the argument, I think you made very clear. It is extremely well written. I mentioned to Swethaa when we were chatting before that it's rare for me to want to read legal scholarship at night like that, and just like it's a novel, and it really is such a pleasure to read. It has a very unique perspective, and especially for me, because it touches on my personal experience as I worked in those kind of elite law firms that are depicted in the book. But I'll dwell on this a little bit later because I want to focus on the main great takeaway of your book. And as you just concluded, Accidental Feminism, and I quote you on this, offers a ray of hope. It offers a ray of hope because there is a pathway to more inclusive frameworks that could come out of these accidents. And for me, it was really fascinating to see that these elite firms in India were exhibiting exceptional levels of gender parity. And as you said, not because of commitment or trying to create a feminist organization. The structure outside and inside the firm come together to do gender differently, as you explained. So what's interesting is also the lack of claiming of feminism. You answered this, of course, in the first part of your presentation, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about the motivation and the research, the reasons behind the project. You talked about the motivation at the initial stage, but I'm very curious to see whether or not your motivations have evolved, and I'm sure they have, as all researchers and working on this project for a substantial amount of time, they must have evolved. So many aspects of the work impress me. Of course, I mentioned the form, and I think everybody should be very encouraged to pick up a copy, not only to look at the body of the text, but also the notes and the footnotes that explain your thought process and the thought process behind the analysis. And this is a lot for me to say that I was delighted to read the notes. The argument is original, obviously, and of course, the detail empirical work. And that really calls us to pay closer attention to methods and the importance of testimony. And this is something that sometimes legal scholars don't really pay attention to. So if I can, I will take a little bit of time to discuss those methods, although you've done such a good job of telling us how you went about this. But of course, I'm a socio-legal scholar myself, and I like to learn from others, and there's a great deal to be learned from this particular piece of work. I'm interested in empirical work and qualitative methods. You've proceeded to observation and in-depth semi-structures interviewed. You said 139 professionals over 4 years. I think that in and of itself speaks of the volume and the level of detail of your research project. And you said, and I quote you again here, that the project is about how subjective experiences of individual actor afford us windows into meaning-making processes. And this is something clearly that we neglect when you think about testimony, because sometimes we think about it as anecdotal rather than a sense-making exercise. So if you could share a little bit more on this, because I think that's one of the juicy details that I really wanted to get to when I was reading your book. Can you tell us a little bit more about, of course, the testimony of your participants, but also your thoughts as the interviewer from your standpoint of a critical legal scholarship? I also wanted to know whether the participants felt fully comfortable in giving out details, because it had potentially serious implications on the things you were asking about. So it's a very original for me methodology. You explained that you had a research design that is triangulated in 3 sites. And I think that you mentioned this in your presentation, but we would want to hear more about this as social scientists and maybe some students that came tonight. because you added this last comparative case, and that was not an initial kind of intention, if I understood properly. So I would like to hear more about this too. So at some point in the conclusion, you mentioned that you've been pitching your work to audiences outside of your field and the importance of doing that. And you said that in many years you've pitched that work and you did not automatically get responses from people that found synergies in your work. And that speaks to the deeply interdisciplinary nature of your enterprise. Again, I'm very selfish thinking about my own PhD writing in healthcare law. And I wonder now, how is your research received? How has it been received by peers inside of your discipline and outside? And what do they find as the main contribution? Do they find similar contributions to be original or not? I have another more difficult question on that. And I wanted to know if you thought that it is only possible to create significant social change by placing oneself in a zone of intellectual discomfort. I'm pretty sure most of the audience would say yes to that, but I'd love to hear kind of a more detailed answer on your part. So you even address the doubts that you have about the usefulness of your research, which I thought was very funny because the book makes so many crucial and original contributions. Of course, this notion of accidents that you've unpacked is pivotal in understanding this underexplored phenomena. I think the idea of accidental feminism resonated very much with me, but another one that very much resonated with me is the idea of accidental allyship that is present in the preface of your book and the chapter. And you even mentioned your mother that's here today. And I thought that was absolutely endearing, but also very telling, because you talk about her as an accidental adoptee. And this is something I can relate to because that really mirrors my path to feminism, I would say. I'm a comparative researcher, so I wanted to compare my experience to your findings in a way, and also the experiences of women that have worked alongside me in the law firm for the very short years that I was practicing corporate law in an elite law firm. So I came to Paris, I studied in Paris, my own experience. I was a young woman looking for a job in the law firm, like we would say. I'm from an ethnic minority background, and I was entering a very gendered world and in some ways institutionally racist. I was deeply unaware that I had a group of women supporting me when I entered the law firm and lifting me in very difficult situations. What I was aware of, however, was my privilege. I had been educated in elite law schools. I was part of an elite institution with the law firm, and I came from a very comfortable middle-class background. But interestingly enough, I was made to feel very differently when I came to the law firm. I was told that I was the right kind of ethnic minority candidate because I was ticking multiple boxes as being a woman and ethnic minority at the same time. So it was the good immigration, the one that they liked, they even said, and even better because I was a woman. So this made me think of your point about frames of references. They certainly had one about what a lawyer should look like and potentially what a lawyer fulfilling the quota should look like, and I did. So these women that were also what we call stagiaires or trainees in France at the same junior level as me were acquainted to one another because, of course, they were part of the same law school sometimes, and they were socialized, as you explain in your book, in a similar way. There's also a new movement at that point in French legal education with regards to socio-legal teaching, and that transpired in the interaction that I had with my colleagues. But also one thing we had very much in common was the lack of support from the more senior level female colleagues. We were equally critical of them as partners. We often criticized their personal circumstances. We were not shy of that, their leadership style. And on this very point, I know you focused mainly on women on senior level, but I wondered when reading, did you come across younger associates commenting on these women in position of partnership during your interviews? And did they see them as trailblazers or simply as individuals that were put there at the right place in the right moment, accidentally? We did not feel actually that women in senior leadership roles were allies. They were not accidental or intentional allies because of their behaviors, and their behaviors trying to match the white male counterparts in the law firm. They were also making a lot of remarks on our work ethics and our behaviors, and they were kind of more keen to hire junior white male colleagues than women. They were also noticeably harsher when it came to work, and they often said that we're working for them more than working with them. But nonetheless, I think that the idea of allyship, indifference, and not knowing that you are an ally is very, very strong and very much resonated with me, because I felt it after the fact. And I wondered, just like you, and again, here I will have to quote you, how do we replicate the accident with more intention? So if there is change and support for greater gender parity is achieved accidentally because of circumstances that have aligned, as you described, does that mean that social change can only lay when a particular constellation of circumstances is present? And that's another question for you. I'm thinking about example that I know, of course, the French law firms, and also as Quebecer, the Canadian women in global law firms that I know. And I see one or more elements of the ones that you unpicked in your book that's missing. The first one is what you talk about, the family aspect, the personal support of other women that are not in employment and could take on kind of the domestic work for these women while they're at the law firm. We have not seen these elements very much in the Canadian context. The opportunity and alignment of the law firm values with the ambition of women, however, is present. But in the Canadian case, it's very interesting because there are clear statements about gender parity. There's a conscious effort to name women partners, but there's very little accommodation for women, for example, that would want to pick up their kids from school. So the intention is not agnostic, but the results are unfortunately not present. So as you ask very rightly, is parity feminism? The increase of number of female partners itself does not say much about feminism. It really lacks texture. So how do we transpose these positive accidents? How do we learn from them? And here, I'm just going for the North American cliche that you depicted. I'm being very North American. I want to know how we can solve this. You obviously thought about this throughout your writing, and I wanted to know whether you had some ideas, whether you know how to replicate those accidents with more intention. My very last point is about feminism itself. And I wondered whether you would say that feminism should serve as a roadmap, or should it be something that we should embrace to consciously want these accidents to become intentional approaches to a real feminist feminization of the workplace? So I won't say more because you have so much to talk about. It's more interesting than my commentary for sure. But thank you so much for this fantastic book. Really, I had such great pleasure reading it.
All right, thank you so much, Sabrina. Swethaa, would you like to respond to Sabrina's comment?
To the 17 points Sabrina made that like makes me want to write a new book? Yeah, absolutely.
Volume 2.
That was so generous. That was just so incredibly generous. Thank you. Wow. You know, I can't even read my own handwriting. I was writing so quickly. But this is just, so I will say a couple of things just in response to your idea of like motivation and the research questions. I think I'm going to start with that because those are easier to somewhat answer, I think. So when I first presented this talk, just before the book was released, one of my first book talks, I had a member of the audience ask me why I used such a specifically critical personal lens in framing my data. And the way he framed it was, you have such good data, right? Like, it's like, this is such substantial data. Like, why did you choose to make it personal, right? And Really, that question was a methodological question. So the question is, you could have done this as a social scientist. Why did you do it as a critical legal theorist? That was really the underlying question, right? It's like, why do you use a critical race method to unpack findings that could otherwise be unbiased as just data? And I think my use of that framing is very political, right? I think if I don't bring myself into my research, it will be brought into it on my behalf, right? Like so there's no way in which people from the periphery can organize in the center without the periphery being attributed to them. This just is, it's just a thing, right? So unless I am writing from within the core of what is considered a specific strain of scholarship, anything I do that is seen as a radical intervention is going to be attributed with specific logics, which is why, as I was joking a little bit with Sabrina before the talk, that I had to tell my publisher that I had 38,000 words in footnotes. And she was like, this is an entire article. Like, why is your why are your notes so comprehensive? But it was very political. I was like, I need people to know like what positionality is clear, because if I make visible my positionality, then there is a way in which you read the argument that has coordinates that I want to have, right? And part of writing a book that says feminism can be accidental is the deep, tremendous worry that it can be co-opted by people who want to take that argument to do things that you don't want done with it, right? So Ratna Kapoor, who I adore and learned so much from, right? Her last book on like gender alterity and the fishbowl, right? She makes this incredibly provocative argument about how to think about alterity. And then she says, I know there are people who can take this, because she compares the Vedas, she compares like a very specific strain of Brahminical scholarship to critical legal theory. And she makes the argument that I know there are people who can take this and fundamentalize it in ways that I don't want, but that cannot stop me from making the argument, because radical scholarship sits at that, I love the phrase you use, academic discomfort, that is what produces it, right? So you need to live in that sort of sense of incapacity to be able to produce the scholarship, but also need to make sure your particular coordinates of it, and who I am today is probably not who I'm going to be in 5 years, right? So there might be a version of this book that gets reviewed in 5 years, where I think back and I was like, oh, I feel that way about it. Like, I wear so many of my identities more lightly now than I did even 5 years ago. And I think it's worth remembering that that sense of flexibility is necessary, but so is the coordinates of these data. So that's a sort of meta philosophical answer to like, what was the motivation? But to the point on actual data, the sort of grounded theory approach that I'm trained in sort of recognizes that the perspective of actors is what the data is, right? That all data is biased, that everybody is doing a version of it that brings in their perspective. And so using that I was never questioning that as a sociolegal scholar, but I also had like comrades that were doing similar work that I could learn from and cite and draw strength from. And Manya, you do this, like you do parts of this, even though you're a historian, right? Like there's versions of this that you do in your work. The triangulated research piece, the last comparative case actually came from a workshop. I was at a workshop, and no one can present something about India without somebody that doesn't study India in the room saying, yes, but what about caste, right? Or isn't this just about class, right? And this is like it's like the word intersectionality in other scholarship, right? Like it's one of those things you drop to remember that you know a thing that is going to change the thing. And so I was like, of course, like as somebody that thinks caste is central to all of this, of course it is central. It would be like arguing that class or race is not central to any analysis. But I was much more interested in the sort of curiosity of what that intersection can produce that is positive in some cases, but not in others, right? So it was important to me to hold a certain cohort of urban, upper caste, middle class women in a specific context, in the same city, in the same kind of elite professional work, and vary one place where they were doing well and one place where they were not. Like that, to me as a social scientist, like that was the analytical interest, right? I'm like, of course caste matters, but women have had caste privilege forever. And caste privilege usually doesn't perform itself in this particular way. And it usually is bound by other notions of respectability and family consciousness and the need to not work, right? Or the need to sort of not be rewarded for such work in the same sorts of ways. And so this idea that caste was the only thing explaining it did not serve my analytical purpose, right? Like as someone that's completely committed to the idea that caste and class was central to all of this. So it was important to add a case where all of that was present, but there wasn't this outcome. And so it was analytically varying all of my nodes of interest, except this one thing, which was just that they were foreign firms in India that could afford to say, oh, you know, India is just so terrible for gender, in a way that domestic firms that were trying to prove that they were modern just couldn't do. And so that's why that firms chapter, right, the speculative isomorphism chapter became like the lead article that before the book came out, because that became the thing that would signal what was specifically different about this. But it feeds into your next question. I mean, it's elegant, the ways in which you've asked these questions, because they feed so well into the narrative. I appreciate that. Which is this idea of what is it, you know, why did I add in, what did that do to agoraphobia, right? I spent the first 7 years of this, every time I would present it, feeling like I was not critical enough, I was not feminist enough, I was not queer enough, I was not post-colonial enough, I was not, you know, sociological enough, I was not law enough, I was not enough in any of these things, right? But that's the discomfort that wanting to please all humans does, right? And as grad students, you're sort of stuck in that mode. I mean, forget grad students, as scholars, we're stuck in that mode. We want to talk to everybody at the party and if you're writing in a space which doesn't have already established cliques at these parties, then you're trying to make peace with all of the humans, right? Like it's sort of the question then becomes, how do you talk to the people you want to talk to without losing the core of what it is you're saying? So I sort of felt really, I'm so grateful for the amount of discomfort that produced it, because it was all the conversations I didn't have that made me feel confident enough in the conversations I wanted to have, right? And that's not easy. I mean, I have grad students now that it's impossible to say that to. And that's why the research methodology is like a theoretical section in itself, right? Like I wanted students to know that there is ways in which that process is going to feel really uncomfortable, to also feel like it's not going to end. Like I have an amazing job now, I'm so grateful, but I didn't have that job for a long time because I couldn't publish from this research until I was ready to let it go, right? And I wasn't ready to let it go for much longer than I might have been if I was writing with, you know, a fixed data set with X number of research questions that was already feeding into an exacting ideology. The rewards have been better for it, but it was not, I mean, there were times when I didn't know if the agoraphobia was going to feed off. So I'm really grateful that it did. But yeah, it's sort of the discomfort as method is really helpful. Your idea about allyship, such a generous reading, this idea of like really taking that concept and offering it space. I'm so grateful, because I think there is something about that logic of second generation women in power that sort of produce afeminism or masculinity or like toxic masculinity in ways that are not committed to their gender, right? Like that exists. But part of it is also when, I'm guessing in your French law firm, the women partners were few and far between, right? So there's a certain version of sort of structure holding that they had to do that was also dependent on their gender, right? So it's a very specific case of needing to do gender a certain way, both to protect your own interests, but also to say, I worked this hard and I got this far and I beat all the odds, and so you should be able to too, right? Which is a classic narrative of like in gender and work scholarship on how that gets reproduced, which is slightly different if half the women in that position are female, right? So you're going to have somebody who does toxic masculinity, but you're also going to have somebody that doesn't, in the same way that you're going to have a man that does toxic masculinity, but you could also have a great mentor who could use his resources to like advance you, right? So then gender is not what changes it, it's personality, which is really the best outcome diversity can have, right? Because if you get to an outcome where humans are sort of on a spectrum of useful and not useful based on their own existence and not based on their gender replication or their race's replication, then you actually do have a true comparative sample of who's in positions of power. And so I guess that was sort of part of it. But I think this allyship is really useful because that, again, to fit into your next question, is incredibly portable, right? So you said, what are the constellation of examples that can happen? This constellation is not going to happen each time. But the more I talk about this book and the more I think about, my next project is on, to speak to your specific, thank you again for sharing about your story, but to speak to your specific point about you being the perfect kind of diversity. So my next big project is on diversity aesthetics. So I'm tracking all the websites of law firms across places to see what bodies they use to do diversity and to sort of track and do interviews with both officers that are chief diversity officers who are brand new, right? Majority of whom, you guessed it, are women of color, whereas partners are 2% women of color, right? So it's like, who do you leave to do the work of diversity? And what resources do you give them? And what does success look like for them? And who is it? And so I use a racial capitalism model to actually argue that, in fact, it profits the firm to say, oh, guess what? We made this person the diversity partner, right? Without giving them the power to actually make structural change and making them responsible for doing bad diversity, right? So there's this sort of the extension to this is to think about whose bodies are we profiting from? How does that change labor dynamics? And how does that, and that's sort of where I am in answer to your first question. Where am I as a scholar? Like, that's where I'm at. I'm trying to think through, what does it mean when we say we're doing good diversity? And like the US, especially after this past year, has been responding to this call for doing better diversity. But what does that look like? And who is it on behalf of? And what does real equity look like? I would argue that it's not just whether people with families should be allowed to go pick up their children. It's also whether single queers should be given mental health resources that are beyond what they have, right? So if you actually care about equity, we need to think about dependency beyond biological dependency or marital dependency or logics. All of it is within a straight narrative of what we think dependency is. So if you actually expanded that dependency, I see the queers in the room nodding. So yeah, solidarity. Like, there's just usefulness into expanding how that can feel and be, right? So that's sort of like where my head's at. But I've started thinking of it, this is the last point I'll make, of a sort of stock pot, right? Like, I think of it as and I know this is a weird metaphor, but this is what's been coming up for me, this idea of how different things can come together to produce a certain stock, right? And the same things might not be coming together to produce equity in another context, really. But if you pay better attention to what could produce equity, you could produce more incidental constellations that could actually be intentional to produce different kinds of broths, right? It might not be the same broth, but if you have this idea of like needing a certain set of things to come together to produce it, you could see what those ingredients could be in your own limited context to produce what might be, this is too close to dinner to be making a stock pot broth exchange, but yes, that's sort of where I'll leave it. That's, yeah, that's where it's at.
Brilliant, thank you. It was close to brunch time for you, is it? Or...
yeah, I could eat anything.
Great, awesome then. So I'm going to open it up for Q&A. Anyone's welcome to use the hand function or write something in the chat, and welcoming comments as well as questions. If you could say your name and perhaps something about what brought you to the conversation, that would be amazing as well. Brilliant. I can see Vanya there. Can you unmute yourself, or do I need to do that for you? Yes, you can. Great. Go for it, Vanya.
Thank you. There was a bit of a glitch, I think. So I couldn't hear you for a second, but I think you called my name, didn't you? Yeah. Thank you all, really. Thank you, Swethaa. This is fantastic. I can't wait to read this book, and then a lot of your other work as well. It seems that the moment has come finally for the world to see who is our friend, whom we, shared so many wonderful moments with for over years and years of engagement across continents and waters. I'm very intrigued with your accidental methodologies, right? Because it's not only that it seems to me that feminism here is accidental, but also ways in which, some of this data comes together to create these particular conjunctions. And this is really what my question is about. One of the, ways to read it, I suppose, and I very much take to heart when you say, that there's anxiety built into one's research methods and that there are processes and their histories to it, and then, you know, they grow with us as we grow with them as well. But the data is fully gender binary. It's, you know, it's always fully, you know, related to the conceptualization of men and women. I wonder what kind of unintentional parity is there, you know, in that particular formation. I wonder also, you know, how does it relate to your, you know, to your story of the reimagination, or rather the urge to reimagine the ideal worker. So, you know, how much of the produced gender is accidental here? How labor is gender here, not just through optics, but through clothing, through language, through mannerisms, so the professional gender binary that you're tapping in, right? And of course, all the meaning making that comes with it. And how does that all then relate to law as a use value exchange, as the object consumed? There's so many things the law actually, you know, performs here. And, you know, law in this particular context, at least, right, is no longer fully gender binary. So, you know, the question of the binary intersected with the question of law and then gender making. Thank you.
Oh my God, so many years, so many continents, so much water, but also so much gin. I really miss you guys. I wish I was in London. Yeah, it's, you know, I have to say, I want to start by thanking you for the visibility when I wasn't visible to others. Like, I think part of what's been really precious about coming back and doing this here is being able to talk to friends that read this work and thought it was exciting and critical and interesting before I had words for it and before I had communities for it. And I think, I don't know if there are grad students in the group, but if there are, find the humans that find you interesting, because that sort of reminds you that you're having conversations worth having, I think. So thank you for that. I also just, so I think you're asking so many, as per usual, brilliant, expansive questions that are triggering new strains of thought, right? So how do we think of the method as non-binary? But how do we think of the binary that law and labor produce that is both effective but also affective, right? I love the what are they wearing, what are they doing, how are they thinking through this? I think there's something there about imagining the worker, but there's also something there about, I think the book does reinforce a certain logic of the binary, in that there is, because if you can't think of feminism without thinking about the binary, right? Like, that's the unfortunate place we're in right now, right? Like, we're in this like radical feminism versus like trans movement right now, right? Like, in a way where the binary gets reinforced by those who think of rights as progress. There's never been a more important time to think about this positionality. But I think what it offers is the imagination of rethinking what each of those categories is, right? So women, for example, I'll give you one example. So women would wear, they would, depending on the client they were meeting, they would change their dress, right? So if it was a government client, if they had to go to a government office, they would wear a sari because they're like, that's what's gonna work. And like, this is gonna give me more, they're not gonna think of me as a young girl. They're gonna think of me as somebody with status within the firm, and I'm gonna seem as appropriate as possible. And they would not use that same affect would not serve them in another context, right? So there's a sort of continuum even within these categories that gets produced. The second level of analysis is to think about interactions, like when do they actually do what we think of as sort of, you know, masculine, or what they think of as feminine. So I call this like, you know, varied returns to essentialism in like chapter 4, like that's the sort of the interactions chapter. But your question's making me think of whether there is something non-binary about that too, right? Maybe this movement between front and back was actually serving them in a post-category metric that was helpful. And I don't know if they internalized it as that, but so much of, I think, critical research is reading into a thing what you want to see rather than what, I mean, even if you don't say that, right? Like, that's what we're doing. Like, when we're reading data, that's sort of like, we're trying to make an argument from existing categories. And I think there is possibility there for a non-binary logic to labor, but my commitment to reimagining the ideal worker is to sort of be post-category, right? Like, sort of, why are we thinking in terms of, and that's, to go back to the agoraphobia point, Sabrina, that you made, that is so scary to make, because you can't say that without sounding like a bad person, right? Like, you can't, it's like the, you know, when you say human rights is like questionable, there are 3 crits who will agree with you, and then there's everybody else who's like, great, so you're like sitting in some, you know, PhD seminar where 3 other people think the logic of rights is problematic, but what about everybody who depends on it, right? Like, and that's very real, right? And this need to silence ourselves and silo ourselves within these known communities that like see our theoretical purpose but actually don't have practical value is something I contend with a lot and I think through a lot. But in this case, I actually think it helps to just think of dependency and to think of usefulness to organizations without thinking of the gendered categories or the race categories that it can offer. Can that be used in a slippery slope argument in the opposite direction? Yes, but I think it's still worth making because there's usefulness to it as we think about it. I don't know if that gets to you. I'm literally just riffing off of you, Vanya, because I think that's an interesting question. I don't have an answer to like what a non-binary ideal type worker could look like, but I think the promise of that question is very appealing to me.
Thank you. Actually, Swethaa, at some point in the introduction that I also read and very much enjoyed, you mentioned that this this worker that the elite Indian law firm imagines is an agender worker. You use the word agender, which I found really interesting, and I think that no one can do agender better than women. And like you're saying, even the the sensitivity that women or people gendered as women or socialized as women have, in that they would know to wear a sari to when they go and see the government, and perhaps wear a suit to when they go and see their foreign corporate clients or whatever, and know exactly how to comport their body language and their even change their like I wondered so in a sense then this this made me want to ask like the really much bigger question, like this very phenomenon of this accidental feminism that you observed. What does that tell us about gender and feminism also?
A tiny question, I can answer it yes or no.
Just
so tiny. So part of the reason I labored over that preface and the 30,000 footnotes that followed it is really because there isn't an answer to that question, right? Like sort of what does this tell us about gender and feminism? Like, I don't know, that's a category too. And if I'm being post-category, then the category of feminist doesn't actually appeal to me, right? Like sort of, and I know that's sort of like a lazy theorization, right? To say I don't want to, I'm like post-category, I don't want to think about this. Like that feels like a really lazy theorization, but I actually truly think I am unconvinced of the work feminism does anymore. And I think the global South has been unconvinced of the world for years. Like, I mean, there are Middle Eastern feminists that refuse to use the word feminist, right? Like it's a catch-all word, right? Like in ways that are somewhat helpful, right? But it actually isn't serving those that you think it's trying to serve. It just does this same imperialist logic over again in a new context, right? So I don't know if feminism is actually doing the work that we think it's doing, or maybe it is, but who wants to claim it and who feels comfortable claiming it is also so stratified. And sort of, I think, so much of this book really coalesced when I was in Abu Dhabi, when I was thinking through this from the Middle Eastern perspective. And it was so expansive because I ran a transnational feminism roundtable with these really brilliant scholars that I've read and learned so much from, but who I'd have never interacted with if I was not in Abu Dhabi. And that conversation, I think, produced so many worthwhile sort of extensions to that word that I really remained unconvinced if like it was doing work, right? Like if it was one more global north handed down logic, like rule of law or human rights, it's like, oh, let me give you this thing and the free world is going to offer you a new way to do modernity and it's going to be so great. And actually that's not so great. Like, I mean, it's so, Janet Haley and Prabha Koteswaran's like sort of, the governance feminism model of just like, this is one more thing that governments can adopt or organizations can adopt to say, we have done it, we have done good feminism, like we're great. And so check the box and now we can move on. And that is worrying to me, right? Like, because it follows that then it seems to check a clean hands doctrine of what the organizations need to do to keep something going. And so so that's to the feminism point. To the agendered point, which I almost deleted that like a zillion times, right? Like I would write it and then I would cut it off, then I would write it and then I cut it off. And I think the point I was trying to make in that argument, in that particular part of the introduction, is that agendered for the purposes of the organization, in that they were not using gender as the nexus of understanding how this was working, right? They were offering merit as the category. And merit has traditionally not helped women. It has not helped sort of people with low SES. It has not helped like racial minorities. But here, because it was a post-colonial response to this phenomenon, it helped these women. And that's interesting in terms of like, when do these things that normally don't work, right? Like, I mean, decoupling has been written over and over and over again, often by global North elite scholars, right? As we did decoupling. I mean, all these countries try to follow what we're trying to do, but you know what? They have the intention, you know, Sabrina, you offered this in the Canadian case, but like they have this intention, but they can't produce the outcome. So having decoupling happen in the opposite direction to me is actually really interesting. It's also really interesting that it's happening in India, which is only ever in the news for gender because of like one more gang rape or one more terrible, horrific incident, right? Like there's no, and that was another part of the agoraphobia, this worry that because I wasn't writing about a development context in India, there is going to be just this fact that I wasn't getting it right. Like this must be a minority. But like the longer I sat with it, the more convinced I was that if those that thought this wasn't worth it because it wasn't developmental, were actually performing an imperialism in their ideas, right? If you think that every book on India has to be a development book, that says more about your perspective on what research on the global South ought to be than it does about me, who's actually studying elites in it, right? Like no one questions elites in professional work when you write about it in the global North context, right? It's just one more book on elites in the global North. The minute you write about elites in India, like you better have a critique of caste because otherwise it's not critical. And that to me, like talking about post categories and you know this idea of the age, so that was the political context of using the word agendered. It was that gender was not at the core of this. It was a range of other factors. And it was interesting to me that it was other factors and not gender, but it wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't class, it wasn't caste. Holding all of that constant, something else was still happening. And how do we think about that? I don't know if that answers it.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Do we have any other questions from the room? So
I feel committed to not making anyone stay a second over on Zoom if they don't have to.
Well,
Dee looks like she's about to say something. I find you, I'm going to cold call you. I mean, that's what a lot of professors do.
Yeah, I actually was very interested to just know more about your decision to focus in on Mumbai and what some of the sort of other confounding variables were around other spaces. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons I'm interested is because I've spent days last month reading reference letters for graduate student fellowships, actually from around the world, but a lot of them were from India. So I've also been really thinking about the diversity of reference letters and what is in reference letters, you know, and how people are gendered in reference letters and how they're connected back into families and class and, you know.
Oh my God, this is a data set.
You're
sitting on an anonymizable data set. Like, I mean, let me know if you want to write about this. This is amazing.
Right. Yeah, so that's and a lot of those were again about, you know, these young women who were first women, you know, so they were exceptional in some sense. So I'm really interested in that. And then the other question is just, you know, so we think about, I mean, I think I was trying to sort of think as you were talking about whether this is a global South thing, but this sort of, you know, jumping on opportunities and trying to consolidate opportunities and so on. And I was just wondering how consolidated this is. So you're looking at something over a period that's developed over a period of 3 decades, right?
Yeah.
You know? And you know, can you imagine it just simply being pushed back, that you would look at it in 10 years time or 20 years time and be like, you know what, there was this moment, and then it dissipated.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question. I should have addressed it in more clearly, because the conclusion really talks about what the time limit on this is, right? It's this very, you know, like, what do we do now? Like, now that we have this, is this going to be a short-lived advantage? Especially since the last chapter talks about the very specific time logics of having mothers and in-laws who are not in the workforce and a dependent labor force, right? So it's the sandwich generation that inherited the politics of liberal feminism in their generation. So I'm talking about women in their late 20s to their, you know, late 40s, maybe, like that 20-year period, who inherited the politics of like good diversity or like good inclusion, right? But without the histories of that social movement. So it's not like the Indian feminist movement, it was not concentrated on professional women getting into work. I mean, the feminist movement is so rich, and those elders have like such an important commitment to doing feminist politics. And Srila Roy actually has a phenomenal set of articles on like the politics of this movement. But the production of it was not aimed at the professional workforce, right? So there's something very specific about this generation of women that had, and if I had children, right, like my mother would be part of that I'm winking at you, but you can't tell. But it's sort of like there's a very specific logic of what that means for a specific generation of humans that had access to parents that would take care of their children, right? But also that were proximate. And you can imagine that being a one generational advantage, right? Like that's going to pass. And could it be pushed back? Absolutely. But I think the sort of the reason I end with hope is because the numbers have just, it's not a consolidated sample. It's a very tiny sample. And one of the things that could change it is if you can imagine law firms opening up, right? Like if the market opens up and there are these foreign law firms that come into the market, then it changes the nature of who feeds into these schools and who feeds into these pipelines. But I think there's something about firms whose organizational, institutional memory and history have the number of women that they do and the range of women that they do, right? Like, and that changes. They could all, you're right, there could be an exodus, right? They could all leave and at the same time because they think this is not what they want to do anymore. But there aren't very, very many other spaces to go, right? So the oasis of parity that sort of offers opportunity is also what confines them. And so there's like this structural predicament that forces them to reproduce a certain kind of gender ideology within this context, which might sort of serve them or not. Could it change? Yeah, I mean, I think it could. And I think that's why this idea of like moving it into intentional foci, right? Like to make sure we're using this chance at opportunity to reinforce how to make this more intentional is really crucial in the Indian context. Is it the Global South thing? I think the more I think about the project now, I think of it as like how much of this is responding, how much of this is responding to ideas of the Global South, right? Like how much of it is responding to this imagery of the Global South that we're trying to unpack and push back on, and how useful is it to push back on it too, right? Like maybe they are following these norms and that's gonna change. Why Mumbai, so I wanted to select on the dependent variable in the most progressive city where women were doing the best and show how, despite that, they were only 5% of the population, right? So despite that, there's only one woman at the time of my data collection. There were only 2 women who were senior counsel in the Bombay High Court. There were 218 men, right? Like at the time. So to me, I was like, this is the most progressive site. So if I'm going to see, if this is just a Bombay story, this is just like, you know, women in Bombay are modern and women in Delhi, like, unfortunately have to deal with like, you know, historic sexism and classist logics of what is happening, right? Like there are these family firms and there's all these other moving parts of how the legal profession was organized, and Supreme Court's in Delhi, right? So there's all these, litigation was definitely the hub. So where corporate practice was flourishing was Bombay, but it was also where it was most likely, where if you were going to see this drastic change in how modernity had changed progress narratives, it was going to be there. And so the fact that even there the change was so drastic, I think helped make the argument a little bit clearer on how much of it was a production of like global forces. And the firms I was studying, like Bombay was, I mean, the financial markets are in Bombay. And so like that's sort of where all of the work was going. So to the extent I wanted to sample on where was the most domestic firms that was progressive, but also responding to a global audience, that was where I was going to find it the most. But I was fraught. Like, there were other ways in which Delhi would have been a great sample. And part of it is also, I didn't want to spend 6 years living between California and Delhi, and I really didn't want to do that with Bombay. So it was also a personal choice of where I wanted to split my time, which I think sort of, you know, it sounds flippant, but when you're living between countries, as I've made a life of doing, it sort of helps to have a city that you wanted to go back to. And I actually cared about the construction of it. And I was a corporate lawyer in Bombay, like many, many years ago. And it sort of, I think that both helped and hurt, right? It helped because I knew these people and I could figure it out. Oh, you asked a question, Sabrina, you asked a question about younger associates. I misrepresented. So a third of my sample is junior associates who are just coming in, and how they conceptualize senior associates. So the senior associates were just to figure out what success looked like. That was the only reason they were oversampled. Like, a third of the sample is junior associates who had not yet come to mid-career, and like they were just moving through the pipeline. And the reason I focused on them and not the more famous senior associates is because I didn't want narratives in the press to change how I was thinking about the narratives they were giving me. Because there's so few like very senior, very powerful partners that using them was not going to actually serve like my analytical logic. So a third of them were junior associates thinking through what their path looked like. And so one of my questions was like, can you tell me how you see your career unfolding if you stay here, right? Like, and so their vision board for what their I always end my interviews with like, what's the next 5 years? What's the next 10 years, right? And their capacity to see themselves in these firms was one of the things that made me feel like this was creating a structure where there was opportunity that they felt was deserving and responding to them. Like, I mean, none of these people were like on joy rides, right? Like, there was clearly a sense of this being hard, and there being struggle, and there being ways in which this was going to hurt. But it was a compromise they were willing to make and do. Thanks, Dee. And I really want those letters. I feel like this is just an incredible data set.
Awesome, thank you. So do we have any other questions, or perhaps Sabrina?
We're talking for an hour and a half about a book most people have not read. Well, I really think we should let people go enjoy this fun.
I guess it leaves me just then to thank you all so much for coming and sharing and participating, and thank you so much, Swethaa, for sharing so much of your self, your story, your book, and so much more. And Sabrina, for reflecting and for holding it and for making space for the ideas and adding your own as well. So before I close, I would like to ask you both as well, if people want to find out more about your work, where can they do so? Can they follow you on Twitter, for instance? And also, do you have, I know, Swethaa, you have another book coming out soon. And do you have any other events that you'd like to plug, either you or Sabrina as well?
No, no.
No?
I will be speaking at SLSA on a very unrelated topic tomorrow if you want to go and watch.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my plug.
I just want to say thanks. This has been great. This is so generative, and I appreciate really the generosity of both your comments, Sabrina, but also the invitation, and Dee and Vanya for adding in. Thanks so much.
Brilliant.
Thank you. Fantastic book.
Okay, thank you. Well, a great virtual round of applause to you both and to all of us in the room.
Thank you.
And so you can follow the Center for Law and Social Change on Twitter. It's at Law Social Change. And we are listed on City's list of research centers. We are in the process of setting up a mailing list as well, but we'll be tweeting about any future events. So thank you so much. Have an amazing rest of your day there in California, and an amazing evening, most of you, and night.
Thank you.
Yeah, as well. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
I wanted to stay on just to say thank you as well, Sabrina. That was really amazing.
Thank you so much, Grietje. It was great. It was an amazing book, and I'm so glad I met Swethaa. She's amazing.
Yeah.
And I'll ping you an email about something completely different over the next day or so, but it's nothing related to that. But thank you so much.
Okay, awesome.
I really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much. I thought there were so many synergies between both your like work and your like, you know, there's so much. Yeah, it was like perfect. I think it was really.
I'm happy you liked it too. That's
so
great.
All right.
Have a great evening. Bye.
Bye.